All right, guys, so we just want to finish out this particular lecture as part of this unit before we move on to kind of our campaign finance stuff that we will do together on Friday. So the question in the next slide here, and we really only have 3 slides that we're going to look at, is, you've come out of convention, you moved into the general election campaign. What is your media strategy, right? Like how do you get your message across to voters? What is the media strategy? And the first and most simple answer to this question is the strategy for a media campaign is to get attention, right? Campaigns want attention. It is something that Donald Trump has done remarkably well over the last 5 years, via tweeting. Anytime it seemed like Americans were focusing on other things, it almost seems like he would manufacture controversy or crisis to get the attention back on him. And this has worked out really well for them, or well for him, because it allowed him and other politicians who do this um, to basically harness the power of the American focus for very little money, right? Because you can post a tweet and everyone's talking about it and it's being discussed and posted on CNN and Fox News and et cetera, and it didn't cost you a dime. Well, that was amazing press coverage, right? But for the rest of the people who don't have quite the Twitter following that Donald Trump has, um, your advertising budget as a candidate is a pretty strategic move, right? And so, in addition to Twitter, a lot of candidates have historically looked for ways to create attention and get free news, right? So they'll say, they'll have one of their campaign staffers call a television station in Colorado Springs and say, Joe Biden is going to be at Phantom Canyon Brewery tonight at 8. Shaking hands, talking to Colorado voters, pouring some beers, etc. Well, if he makes those calls to the news stations, who do you think's showing up? Well, probably the news stations, right? Recording him doing exactly what Hillary Clinton's doing in that top picture. And it goes out on all the news channels, and the candidates say, cha-ching, cha-ching. We just got a lot of positive press coverage of showing, you know, Joe Biden as a regular guy just talking to Colorado voters, and it didn't cost him a cent, right? And all of this stuff is highly, highly strategic, right? When you form a campaign, you're appointing a communications manager, you're promoting deputy communications managers, social media managers. You have a whole team designed purely to increase your exposure, to get attention, to get your message across. And so they end up kind of coordinating everything um, in that general election campaign. Where you eat, right? Eat at restaurants that are staples in communities, right? That are seen as longtime favorites. Who do you have on stage with you? Well, maybe you're not super popular in Colorado Springs, so you'd look out and you say, who, maybe Electra Johnson. She's really popular in Colorado Springs. Let's make sure when we go to Colorado Springs that she's standing next to us on stage. Let's put out a call to her. Um, to even when they announce a policy, right? Basically, the way campaigns work is Friday is oftentimes a news dump day, meaning if you have to get information across, but you don't want to get a lot of attention on it, you basically leak it out or release it about Friday at 4 p.m. and it goes into the weekend and it just dies most of the time. Monday morning would be prime news time. So if you release a story that you really want to get a lot of attention on Monday morning, it's going to get significantly more exposure as people head into their work week. Now, this is all kind of like a very strategic and very difficult thing that the campaigns really focus on. It's hard to control, but it's not impossible. Basically, you have people who, and we're going to talk about these as trial balloons, but the campaigns will feed news to media outlets, and basically say, hey, psst, don't tell anyone I told you this, but Tuesday next week we're gonna announce a big healthcare policy. Psst, psst. And then the news run with it and say the breaking story. The Joe Biden is going to release a healthcare plan next Tuesday, and suddenly the world is watching and paying attention. Um, and this is all very coordinated, right? And the news doesn't have to cover it, but oftentimes will, especially if you have a good communications director who understands how the game is played. And campaigns generally like to balance the releasing stories of doing human interest stories, like look at Joe Biden's new dog, you know, what's his name? I forget what his Major. Joe Biden's dog Major. He's the first rescue dog coming from a shelter in American history, living at the White House, versus like, no, here's Joe Biden's healthcare plan, right? And so campaigns and their media teams often try to balance those things. If it's all policy, people start to feel like they can't relate to you, right? Like they don't know who you are. But if it's all human interest, they say, well, there's no substance here. We don't really know what he stands for. And so communications directors are kind of living in that sweet spot of both. Let's move on. So the next question is now that we've talked about how the media can be manipulated, how media strategy works to increase exposure for a campaign, let's look at just basically the question of, is this focus on the media hurting democracy? Right? And this is a tricky question because obviously there's pros and cons to this, just like we talked about with the primary process. And so let's start with the critics, right? The cons. The critics will basically argue that politics today is not even really about policy. It's about creating an image of yourself as a candidate, of basically peddling this image. Ah, Joe Biden is just a regular guy, good guy, likes people, can speak in complete sentences, and that's his thing, right? Versus like Donald Trump, straight shooter, calls it like it is, says what's on his mind, which is really the things that it's also on your mind, but you're too embarrassed or ashamed to admit it. And so these images that candidates are putting forth become, in critics' minds of media focus, more important than the candidates themselves, right? And that this is all style over substance. That focuses more on who somebody is trying to seem on the television as opposed to like actually what they stand for and what their policies are. And you don't have to copy this, but the quote is, the idea that you can merchandise candidates for high office, like breakfast cereal, is the ultimate indignity to the democratic process. And I think this quote sort of ties back to sort of the founding fathers who fundamentally couldn't imagine a world with the internet or television or all this stuff where, we don't even have to know what somebody stands for. We just have to know what they look like in a 30-second ad or a couple viral shares, being passed around Facebook. Now, the rebuttal here, right, from people who say no, media is not hurting democracy, is that they can point to political science studies that basically show that people, despite ads being kind of cruddy and generally pretty simplistic, that actually people do learn candidates' positions from ads. And that, when you basically are polling voters on which type of ads they prefer, which type of ads are more valuable, that actually the policy ads, the ones that say, Donald Trump stands for end to open borders to building a wall, right? That these policy ads typically outpoll image ads with voters from a 6-1 margin. An image ad would be like, look at Donald Trump holding that baby and chasing a dog and loving on his wife. That those ads don't poll nearly as well as ones related to policy. So the last slide for today, and then we're going to call it, is who is needed to run an effective campaign. And this is essentially basically looking at the staff members that are involved in a modern day political campaign. And so the first one is quite simply your campaign manager, right? This campaign manager is incredibly important. They basically are being the high strategist of what your campaign is going to focus on, how it's coming across, and make key decisions. What states you're traveling next to. Oh, you're really suffering with seniors. Let's get you some FaceTime with seniors. Campaign managers are high level thinkers designed to kind of drive the campaign forward in strategic ways. Other key positions would be fundraisers. As we already know, campaigns are incredibly expensive. I don't have the final total for 2020 yet, but the last time I checked, it was in the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the 2020 presidential and Senate campaigns. And so, good fundraisers are worth their weight in gold. You also need legal counsel. Legal counsels are basically, lawyers who advise your campaign on, what's legal as far as campaign finance laws, if they changed, or, make sure to file suit in certain states who, might be trying to suppress the vote and requiring things that you believe is unconstitutional. A campaign needs lawyers to basically safeguard the process, to file suit, right? To analyze documents, to look at local laws, to make sure that you're in bounds. And then we talked about this on the last slide, but your campaign also needs media consultants. This is incredibly important in 2020, right? These media consultants buy ads, whether that's on television or Facebook or, other social media outlets. But basically, the job of a media consultant, as I said, is to get attention, to maximize exposure. Now we need campaign staff. And this is where you start coming into the dozens or hundreds, if not even thousands, when you start talking about the presidential election. And interestingly enough, Angel Baeza, who graduated last year with us, was actually one of the few campaign fellows for the state of Florida under the Biden campaign. Angela Pena Diniz was working not for Biden as much as John Hickenlooper, but campaign staff can be, volunteers, all the way to people that basically manage volunteers or make sure that your legion of volunteers is completing the tasks that you need, right? To canvass, to knock on doors, to register voters, that kind of thing. You need logistical assistance to basically do all your scheduling. These are just your type A people that says, tomorrow you got to be in Iowa at 1:30. When you get there, make sure you change into your jeans and a t-shirt, right? So you don't come across as too uppity. You'll be there for an hour and a half before we get in the bus and we drive across state lines to Chicago. We're going to meet with some union leaders to talk about, getting the union vote. You need policy advisors. As we already said, the American political system is designed to allow generalists, people with a general understanding, general knowledge, basically run a country that is incredibly complex. And so there's no way that anybody being elected for president could know like everything. Maybe Joe Biden, he served for 35 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he doesn't, he's pretty good on foreign policy stuff, but if you ask him about economic issues, that's maybe not his lane. And so you need um, policy advisors to make sure that candidates are informed on the complex issues that they're going to be campaigning on. You need pollsters to basically, basically put polls out in the field, figure out where America is leaning. And as we said, what does this do is it basically allows the candidate to adapt their messaging in most important ways. Okay, Joe, you really want to do climate change reform, but we know that if you talk about, AOC or Alexandria Ocasio, people tend to tune you out. So why don't you not call it the Green New Deal and instead talk about investments in solar and wind, right? And these pollsters are basically giving that advice to candidates of how they should talk about things and what strategic decisions. You need a press secretary, somebody whose job is to manage the reporters that are covering the campaign, making sure that the reporters are paying attention to the things that you want them to pay attention to, that they're getting your next campaign stop, and that you're available and answering questions when newspapers and television stations and all that are asking you things, that you are informed. You need web designers, right? And basically, you need the West Wing staff. If you take a look at that top left page, this is the West Wing, the television show. The bottom right is Obama's West Wing. These are real people, right? And at least in Obama's. And those of you who watch the West Wing, you can name these people. You got Sam Seaborn and Leo McGarry. You got Charlie. You got Josh. And you got uh, what's it? Toby, who's my favorite, and I was blanking on his name. That's it for today. Go ahead and answer your questions that go along with this, if there are any. Otherwise, just take your notes. I'm probably going to cut it actually without questions because, quite frankly, I need to get over to writing some letters of recommendation before the deadline on Saturday. Have a great night. I'll see you on Friday.